Okay, we are in the middle of the seventh chapter, and what we've been seeing is King Solomon taking us on a little journey to try and find the ultimate source of wisdom. That's what I came. That's what I've kind of. I think we could identify this query as the main query is the ultimate source of wisdom. He mentioned already that he kind of gave us not buried the lead. He already gave us the lead right at the beginning, or somewhere in the middle, actually. As we said, the seventh chapter is a very long chapter. But in the middle there, he kind of threw in that the real source of all wisdom is going to be uh, the acts of God, Masei Elokim, the acts of God. Which again, we said there's potentially two ways you could look at that. Either we're talking about if you want to take it from a religious perspective, then it's, religiously going to look at the acts of God, the Torah that he gives us, and that's where you're going to find wisdom. Another potential understanding of that was that the acts of God are those undeniable, objective facts, those things that, science, mathematics, those are acts of God. They're just inherent to the nature of the world, and there's no denying them. So that would be another place where you would find wisdom that you can't, is free of subjectivity. Although it's interesting, you find nowadays a lot of discussion about whether a lot of those, whether objective fact is actually objective or subjective, and that's a discussion that's ongoing and probably always is ongoing to some degree or another. But I've just noticed that it popped up a lot more recently, in the past, couple of years, not even decade, just the past couple of years. It seems to that question shows up a lot more. So, but regardless, I think it's still a good choice. But he's been taking us on this little mini side journey, a side quest, if you will, trying to find the ultimate source of wisdom, and particularly when we're talking about wisdom that comes to you from other individuals. So he said, don't reject something that a lot of people agree with. If you find that society as a whole seems to be taking you in one direction, then at least consider it, right? He refers to this as the 10 controllers of the city, right? So you've got 10 controllers of the city. It would be foolish for you to just throw away whatever they say and say, nah, I'm not going, what society considers normal, I don't care about it at all. A person can come to that, a person can come to that conclusion through a logical thought process, but at least to go through that process, at least the person should say, I'm not going to just throw something away if it's what many people believe. At the same time, and this is what he got into in the verse we did last week, was he started to show us that you should also be considering what it is that you hear from everybody and say, you know what, I really have to think about where that comes from. Let's see it in the actual text because it'll be easier to understand there. Okay, here's the screen share. Okay, I'm just setting up my screen over here, and I'm going to review the verse from last week, because as I said, we kind of ended it short last week. But this is our verse last week. This is chapter 7, verse number 21. And he says, Gam, also, so this is kind of in connection to that previous verse where he said, listen to what people tell you, or don't just add a hand, reject it. It says, Gam, also, l'chol hadvarim asher yidaberu, all those things that they speak, al titain libecha, don't give your heart to all the things that they speak. All right. So let me put the emphasis in the right place. I read that without the proper emphasis. Gam, also, l'chol hadvarim asher yidaberu, for everything that they speak, al titain libecha. Don't put your heart, don't give your heart over to that. All right, because you don't want to be stuck, whatever everyone tells you, that's also not necessarily the right thing or the good thing. As we speak, there's this ongoing debate also in regards to Twitter, right? So Twitter's come under control of Elon Musk, one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest individuals in the world, right? So if this supposed to be this free flow of ideas, but it's a big question, big debate in the world nowadays. Is it going to be as free and everything now that it's under this one fellow's control? It was under another fellow's control until now, but whatever, everyone's going to take a side one way or the other. The point is that if you believed everything that you read on Twitter, you'd first of all be very confused because you'd hear a lot of opposing ideas. But it would also, not everything you read Not everything you hear is correct, is true, is untainted, I would say. So don't give your heart. And that's an interesting phrase right there. Don't give your heart. Don't subscribe to everything that they tell you. All right. And he gives us a reason for why not to. Because asher lo tishma et avdecha mekalalecha. Because you don't want to hear your servant cursing you. And so the way I explained it last week, the way we kind of looked at it last week was, on one hand, you've got the 10 controllers of the city. These are people who are respectable. They're the ones that you would typically look to as the guides of information. They're the ones above you in wisdom. And those are the people who we're told to listen to, or at least consider what they say. If you listen to what everybody says, if your ears are open to every single thing that you hear, so then you're going to pick up a lot of other static, a lot of other information coming at you. And that's not going to come from the masters of the city. That's going to come from your own servant, right? That's going to come from people below you. People who rely on you are going to be feeding you information, which is like a flip of this, of how society perhaps should look. Okay. Obviously he's writing this based in a kind of a class society, which we don't have such a thing nowadays. But I think the parable is the same, where on one hand, we're told that there's good information that may come to you when it comes from some sources. There's other bad information that may come to you from other sources. And he refers to this as your servant. I find that the contrast particularly interesting when you look at it as the controllers of the city. We use that word. It's not a typical word, shalitim, the 10 shalitim of the city, controllers. And so that's somebody that you rely on them, right? When we rely to a certain degree on our government. We rely on the forces of governance that we have it around us. We call the police when we need them. We petition City Hall when we need to. So those are people that we look to for helping us, and that's why they've created, that's why they sort of deserve our attention at the very least. Now, on the other hand, you've got somebody who works for you, your servant, and your servant is not somebody who has gained your trust to be somebody that you would listen to. Again, it's a parable, so I wouldn't nitpick it too much. I just thought that was an interesting contrast, that it's not just simply those above you and those below you in a class system. It's those who you rely on and those who rely on you. And when we call this, what does he refer to this as? When you have this relationship, when information is coming at you from your servant, from those who are below you, potentially from those who are jealous of you, or those who need you, he calls that a curse. They will curse you. You don't want to hear your servant cursing you. So I thought that was also an interesting idea, that when information comes to you from a source that is below you, so you have to kind of wonder, is that information, is that being fed to me for my benefit or for my detriment? When here in America, when we revolted against the British, so we were below them to a certain degree, and we controlled a lot of the information, that we're able to utilize that to create this, to sneak our way out from underneath the thumb of the British, right? I just recently was reading a lot about Common Sense by Thomas Paine, who unfortunately his own life didn't turn out very well. Interesting historical side point, but the way that people who were English citizens were able to take that, all the things that they had, and they were able to take their situation and use that to get away or overcome the British. And I think that's also kind of this idea of avdecha mekalalecha. Those below you are looking to equalize or come to an equal status with you. And so when you're hearing information being fed to you from them, maybe that's something to be extra wary of. because they may not be doing it for your benefit, but rather for your detriment. Okay. And so that's verse 21 over there. That was last week's verse. So we're going to move on to verse 22. And he kind of strengthens this point, not just strengthens, he proves the point, I think is really what it is. He proves this idea with this verse. Now, before we get into the actual verse itself, I found it interesting that there are no commentaries on this verse, or none of the major commentaries that we typically use. They are silent here. So I just found that already kind of interesting. But we read the verse like this. Give me one second here. Okay. He says key, because. So whenever you see because, that means it's coming to build off that last verse. Because gam pa'amim rabot, there are many times yodali becha, that you know in your own heart, asher, that gam ata kilalta achirim, that you cursed others. Okay, let's read that one more time. You'll notice over here, just before I read it a second time, that we have one of our kri kativ, meaning it's read one way. We read it ata, even though in the actual, if you look at it in the scroll version, that hey would be missing. It would just say at, which would be feminine, which doesn't fit here. I don't have an explanation why that's written that way and why it's read the other way, but it's just a side point. There are other times where we've had explanations about why that is. This one, I don't necessarily have anything to explain on that. But he says again, ki, however, because, sorry, not however, because gam pa'amim rabot, there are many times, yadali becha, that you know in your own heart, asher gam ata kilalta achirim, that you also have cursed others. And I think that this is really an important point. And I found it interesting that nobody comments on it, because he says, what's the proof that when information comes to you, particularly from those below you in rank and status, when that information comes to you, you have to assume, or at least question, whether it's for your benefit or detriment. You have to think, why do I know that? Because I do that myself. Because we all do that ourselves. When we find ourselves in a relationship where we're trying to get out from under somebody else's control, and we have access to the sources of information, we're going to use that to our benefit. We're going to cause this relationship of kilalta, of cursing, of a klala, of cursing. We're going to do what we can to do this same thing. I think it's particularly interesting when we think about the fact that we do have this relationship with some people, that we are indebted to people. And it's a very hard thing psychologically for human beings to deal with a feeling of indebtedness. We don't like to feel that way. And so in our nature, we always look for ways to do away with that debt one way or another. Either we'll pay off the debt, that's probably the healthiest way to do it, right? If a person feels indebted to another person, to pay off that debt. But there's other tactics that we will use to do the same, to mitigate that feeling of indebtedness that is not necessarily healthy, or are not necessarily healthy, right? For example, we will deny that the good act was done for us, or we'll figure out ways that it's really wasn't so nice, it really wasn't so good. Now, I talk to people all the time about parents. Parents are the ultimate people that we're indebted to, without a doubt. We are by our nature, even if they dropped you on a street corner, right, when you were a baby, you are still indebted to your parents because they gave you life, something that nobody else can give you. So no matter what, we feel a weight of debt to our parents. And the Torah tells us, and society really tells us also, that we have a debt of gratitude to pay to our parents. And so the healthiest way of doing that is to treat them with respect, and to use that, deal with them in a way that's befitting to them. But there's a lot of people who have a hard time with that, who don't feel that they can accomplish that through respect. So we figure out other ways to get away from that need, that feeling of indebtedness. We say, you know what, I don't like how they raised me. They didn't raise me the right way. or it's their fault that I'm stuck in the situation that I'm stuck in. And that no question is exactly this idea of gamata kilalta achirim, that you also curse other people. I've always noticed that to put it, to way oversimplify the idea, there's two types of parents. There's those who let kids do what they want, and there's those who are on top of their kids, right? So and that's just that. I'm obviously, again, tremendously and egregiously oversimplifying this idea, but I've spoken to people who've had overbearing parents, and they say, you know what, my parents were too overbearing. I wish they let me off a little bit more. They talk to people whose parents kind of let them do whatever they want, and they say, I really wish my parents were on me some more. Were on my back a little more, showed me that they cared more, or something like that. So we tend to always want the other one, especially in this relationship where we've got such a debt of gratitude that we owe to our parents. It's very hard. We always want to get away from that debt. So, the people who have one version of the story will be jealous of the ones with the other version of the story, and vice versa. So I think that's a big idea over here, is we see it in our own relationships, that people that we're indebted to the most, we have the hardest time relating to, or we can have the hardest time relating to. I remember one of my teachers once told me that there's a story of the Khatam Sofer, who was a big rabbi in the 19th century, big Hungarian rabbi, one of the leader of Hungarian Jewry in the 19th century. And he once said to somebody, he was having some dispute with somebody, and the guy was not capitulating at all. And he turned to me and said, "What favor did I do for you that you hate me so much?" And that's kind of this. That's really the feeling, is sometimes no one can really despise you that much unless they really owe you something. And again, I think that's the main idea over here, is to pull it back, we know that we do this in our relationships sometimes too, that we see that will sabotage relationships because of this feeling of indebtedness. And so when you see information coming to you, or when you see ideas coming to you, things that are being proposed as wisdom coming to you, but they're coming from sources that feel that burden of gratitude, that burden of indebtedness. So you have to wonder, why are they coming at me with that? Is that information coming at me because it's true, because it's something that's really worth considering, or is it something that's being used to slough off that feeling of indebtedness, and that feeling of needing to be gracious or have gratitude? So the greatest proof here is, look at your own self, and look at your own relationships. We've all, I don't know if we've all, okay, but in our own relationships, perhaps we may have also utilized our position to try to get ourselves ahead, to put ourselves ahead. And we may have done it in our own sneaky ways, whether they're right or wrong. I'm not going to say they're all wrong. There's potentially right ways, right times for that also. But we may have used our own sneaky ways to do the same thing. So when somebody comes to you with the same thing, you really have to question, where is it coming from? And so I thought this is a very interesting idea, because we're talking about trying to find the source of wisdom, the ultimate source, the apex, the super duper, wisdom central. And when we try to find that, who do we trust more than ourselves? And then we look at ourselves, we say, wait a second, I'm not necessarily intellectually honest either. Right? When I come up with my own things, when I say my own bits of wisdom, am I saying it because I truly believe it, or am I convincing myself, or am I, where's that coming from? And I think that's a really tough question to ask. But more than that, it shows you how fallible. I don't know, infallible is a word. Is fallible a word? I guess so. Right? How easy it is for people to not be truthful with themselves. Because look at yourself. You wouldn't trust anybody more than yourself. And you know yourself that you're sometimes not fully truthful with yourself or with others around you, particularly when you're trying to raise yourself up to be to increase your standing in this world. So the idea, the ultimate sense of this verse 22 over here is you are your own proof to why you have to be very careful with information that comes to you, with knowledge, with chachma, with wisdom that comes to you. Is it coming from sources above you who actually want to give to you? Well, that already, he said, be careful. You take it with a grain of salt still. And if it's coming from somebody below you, or from a source that's below you, that's lower than you in whatever status we want to, whether it's a cultural status or a social status or whatever it is, a wisdom status, when that information comes to you, why is that coming to you? Is somebody trying to manipulate you in order to raise their own standing in this world? So that's already an interesting, a very interesting question. Thinking about the ongoing discussions now about, like I mentioned a couple minutes ago, there's these ongoing discussions about whether there is or is not objective science or objective wisdom in this world, whether that's such a thing that exists or not. So that's an interesting question to ask, is who's arguing for which side? Is one arguing for the side because they're in a lower position, they'd like to strive to be higher, or is one in a higher position that's trying to control other people? It's a important question to ask when vetting information. Again, that's like, now that I say it, that's really the point that we're getting to, is how to vet information and realize where it's coming from. And you see this all the time, these studies, scientific studies that are about science, right? Scientific studies that are put out by scientists, and then you find out that it's sponsored by this and this company. The king of these is the terrible studies that were put out saying that fat is bad for you. Fat is what makes people fat. Eating fat, and turns out that was paid for by Big Sugar. Sugar was paying for everyone to look at fat and not think about sugar, when it turns out sugar is really the culprit for a lot of our health problems. So that's like a key case of where you see, hold on a second, I should really be vetting this information more and saying, wow, just because somebody said, just because it comes from a scientist or whatever, doesn't mean it's necessarily correct or incorrect. I have to do my research and kind of figure that out. And not just scientists, I mean, any source of wisdom. Okay. So I think that's an important point that he's bringing over here. Okay, with that, he starts to wind it down. I think we're starting to wind it down in verse number 23. Okay, so verse number 23, and this verse is very interesting because it's got two parts to it. There's the basic understanding, and then we'll tie back in the what the sages bring in over here, which is curiously absent from the commentaries. It's mentioned in the words of the Talmud, but it's actually not mentioned in the commentaries over here. But I'll get there. I'll get to what that is in a second. But let's see the verse first. And he says, Kol zo, all of this, nisiti v'chachma, I have tested in my wisdom. Okay, so nes, which often means a miracle, the word actually means a test. All miracles are really tests. That's a whole other discussion right there, but I won't get into that too much. But the idea of a nisayon is a test. In fact, this week's Torah portion, last week's Torah portion, Vayera, has Abraham's greatest nisayon, his greatest test, which was the binding of Isaac on the altar, where he was told to sacrifice his son, which he didn't really have to do. So that's a nisayon. That's that word nes, nisiti v'chachma. I have tested in my wisdom. All this I have tested in my wisdom. Amarti, I have said echkama, that I will be smart. However, v'hirachokami, many it is distant from me. So he says, let me read it one more time as a whole. Kol zo nositi v'chachma, all this I have tested in my wisdom. Amarti echkama, I have said that I will be wise, but it is distant from me. Okay, and so we find that just an interesting, it's very interesting because we find that what's King Solomon doing, he's saying, I've got all this information coming out. I've got this guy over here telling me one thing. I've got the 10, the 10 controllers of the city on one side. I've got my servant telling me another thing that's really a curse. And what they say, I have to, really inspect. And what this guy says, I have to take with a grain of salt. And so I've got all this wisdom coming at me, or potential, or things that are called wisdom coming at me. And I'm trying to figure out where's the source. Where is the ultimate wisdom coming from? He says, I know, Amarti echkama, I will be wisdom, right? That is an interesting word, because it's not achakem, that I will be wise. It's echkama, I will be wisdom. I will be the source of wisdom. Okay, I will become wisdom. And nevertheless, it seems to be distant from me. And we're talking about, again, well, let's review his chops over here. King Solomon is the wisest of all individuals ever in the history of the world, as testified to by God's prophets. That it's mentioned. We talked about this way back when, at the beginning of the book. But King Solomon is listed as the wisest of all people. It was a gift given to him at the beginning of his reign as king of Israel. So we're talking about the wisest of all people. And nevertheless, he says, I will become the source, the singular source of wisdom, and I still find it to be distant from me. And so that just it throws a monkey wrench to this whole idea of, what do you mean? I'm looking for the ultimate source of wisdom. And you're telling me that King Solomon, the wisest of all people, found it distant from himself. And that really makes it difficult, because how are we going to find that ultimate source? It's not, and the answer really comes that it's not going to be, you're not going to get it from a person. An individual person is never going to be that source, that ultimate source of infallible wisdom. There's always something wrong. There's always some sort of subjectivity there, or some sort of mistake, human error, right? All those things are just, they are natural things in the existence, right? We talked about earlier where he says that in Sadiq Ba'aretz Asher Lo Yachata, that there's no such thing as a righteous person in the land who has done no sin, and that in the context of wisdom, everybody makes mistakes. King Solomon makes mistakes, and we actually know that from the story of his own life, that he made some severe mistakes in judgment, and that had terrible ramifications at the end of his life. He had, through his actions, idol worship was reintroduced into the land of Israel, and peace treaties with other nations fell apart, and it was a difficult thing. And his own son could not even maintain the kingship over the entire Jewish people for his entire reign. It got split, got divided into two separate kingdoms, and after King Solomon dies, because of the actions, because of the mistakes in judgment that King Solomon makes. It's really kind of one of those cases of, the bigger the person, the more severe an error becomes. Because you and I make mistakes. Okay, it affects us, our families, our immediate, those immediately surrounding us. But when the king of Israel makes a mistake, it's a big deal, right? A big deal. So and so we have the human error piece thrown in, and we've got the sin piece thrown in, and we've got the fact that there's subjectivity, and where are we going to find wisdom? And the point is, it's not going to come from a person. It's not going to come from one specific individual, and it's up to each person to vet the information that comes to them, and really question it, and decide whether to accept it or not. In a certain way, I think there's almost a kind of a meta question you could ask on this, that what is wisdom besides for what I want it to be? You could kind of ask that question. Am I content with wisdom as I see it? I, in that question, what you could possibly read this verse as saying the same thing. Amarti echkama, that I will determine what wisdom is. And even with that decision, I still find it to be distant from me. So that's I have to work that out a little bit more. But I think there's something there too, that if you want to even just potential, just throw away the question of wisdom entirely and say, you know what? No, I'll determine wisdom as it comes to me, and it doesn't matter. Who cares? I'll define it as I see fit. That also, you will be stuck in situations of a hirachokami many, that it becomes distant from me itself, because without clear definitions and designations, you're going to be as lost as if you try to find it with all the, with accepting everything. Anyway, I don't have that worked out necessarily, just kind of a thought that's popping into my head right now. From the point of view of the sages of the Talmud, this verse is referring to a very specific question that King Solomon had. We have 613 commandments in the Torah, and we do the mitzvot, we do the commandments because God tells us to do the mitzvot. That's the underlying principle, a very important principle to understand. We enact justice and we set up courts of law, not really because society needs it, but because God tells us to do it. It's kind of a Jewish thought concept, which you could debate it and whatever. We could get into discussion about that at a different time, perhaps. But all of the mitzvot, all of the commandments have some sort of reasoning or logical explanation to them, besides for a certain category of mitzvot, which we refer to in Hebrew as chukim, often translated into English as decrees. It means that there's a certain type of mitzvah, certain type of commandment that doesn't have a known reason for it. There's quite a few of these. Jewish men wear tefillin, we wear the black boxes on our arms and head. There's no real reason brought down or understandable reason why we do that. You could say the same thing about eating kosher, or different ones have different. There are, I guess, grades or levels of what is considered like this. The absolute ultimate case of this is the parah aduma, the red heifer, where we're told that if a person comes in contact with a dead body, they're not allowed to then come in contact with holy items, sanctified, items of the temple, not allowed to enter the temple property until they have the ashes of a red heifer sprinkled on them. And then they wait a cycle of 7 days with 2 sprinklings, one on the 3rd day, one on the 7th day, and then they're no longer, then they go to the mikvah, they dip in the ritual mikvah, and then they come out and they are now allowed to enter the temple property. So that itself is kind of strange, but that's not the point that was difficult to understand. The point that gets difficult is that whoever touches the ashes of the red heifer becomes impure, except for the person who gets sprinkled on. The person who was impure, who gets the sprinkling done on them, that person becomes pure. But the person who was pure, who touches the ashes, becomes impure. So you have this one item that on one hand is a purification item, on the other hand is a contamination item. And that itself is kind of the epitome of non-understandable, illogical Torah concepts. And it has been since the very onset, that when the Torah introduces this mitzvah, it's only one of the few mitzvot, one of the few commandments that it refers to as a chok. There's no known reason for it. Tradition tells us that Moses knew a reason for it, that he was the reason how this works, the mechanics behind it was told to Moses as a gift, but he was the only person he was told never to share it with anybody. Interesting. Okay, again, this is tradition telling us this. And the Talmud relates that King Solomon tried as hard as he could to understand that one piece. That's the one piece that he could not, that was locked away from him. So when he says, I said that I would become wisdom, he's referring to that thing, that one locked piece of wisdom that he could not access, and he find no matter what he did, it was distant from him. I think that, as it often works out, the words of the sages kind of come in line with what we're talking about. Because when we're looking at the story of the red heifer and what's going on over there, we have people who, on the outside, to us, to the viewer, we see them as pure, but they go through this process and they become contaminated. We've got other people who are, as we perceive them, are contaminated, and they walk out of the same process as coming out as pure. And I think it's kind of an interesting parallel to our discussion over here is we've got information, people that you look at sometimes and we say, that's got to be the source of wisdom. Smartest person I know, most well-read person I know. I've never heard anybody quite as eloquent as that person. You say, that's got to be the source of all wisdom right there. I finally found it. And then it turns out that there's more underneath the surface that you don't realize, or they make a mistake. And you see somebody who was pure becoming contaminated. And then you have on other times the exact opposite. Got, somebody who you always assume is, got nothing to them, nothing special. And then after everything comes out, you hear what they say and say, wait a second, there's something really amazing there. And so this is it. I think that is kind of the hidden message in the sage's interpretation of this verse, is that the red heifer is a mirror to the world, so to speak, where you have those that appear on the outside as being pure turning out to be contaminated, and those who look to be contaminated as actually being pure. I recently, just actually this past week, somebody told me about an acquaintance of mine who turned out to be harboring a very dark secret, and it was very shocking to me, particularly because this person was in a position of trying to help people in this very area. It was very shocking. I can't get into much detail with it, but an acquaintance, somebody that I know and I've had a Shabbos meal with and whatever, who is now facing the music for some really rotten things that they were doing. And unfortunately, that happens. It happens in all parts of society, and it happens in all levels of society. And that's, again, here we find that the sources of wisdom, that apex of wisdom, that ultimate source of wisdom that we've decided, I'm subscribing to that ideology. And it turns out, there's things there that aren't so great either. There's things out there that aren't correct, or I could argue with, or whatever. The idea is the same for us, is that we have to be the betters of our own sources of wisdom. Our own, when it comes from inside our heads, and when it comes from outside, from the world we're seeing, we have to vet everything that comes to us and say, what's the motivation behind this? Why am I connecting to this? And what is my what am I subjective, and am I being dragged in this direction for a specific reason? Just as an illustration, I gave a class a couple months ago, right before Passover, about freedom, and I just found it interesting. I'm not going to get into the whole class right now, but I just found it interesting how different people look at the same word, freedom, in totally different ways. Some people look at freedom as being, the ability to make your own decisions. That's kind of the American classic definition of, I have the freedom to make my own decisions. Others look at freedom as power, and you don't have freedom unless you have power. Aristotle says something to that general effect, that freedom does not exist unless you have power, which would mean that forget my own decisions, unless I have power over other people or power in society, I don't really have freedom. So just, we've got all these sources of information. I'm going to lean towards one of them or another because of my own my own biases. So that's going to inform my decision making. So again, when you say, or when King Solomon says, Achkama, I will become wisdom, I will be the sole arbiter of the ultimate arbiter of wisdom, you find, wait a second, here many. It's actually distant from me. And we're going to discuss this idea of distance in the next verse also, but that will have to wait till next week. So thank you all for joining us. We will end the share here. And all right, thank you for coming. I'm glad I was able to get through it. My voice is doing a little better.